All right, so Young Thug is home. He took a deal and now he's out of custody. But since he's been released, now it's coming up again the topic of Gunna and whether he's a snitch or not. There's been reports that Young Thug has been messaging directly other rappers, basically calling Gunna a snitch. And for me, I just think it's absolutely ridiculous. I'm sorry. And I get it. I'm a civilian, right? I'm not a street dude. I'm not a gangster. There's a couple of there's a couple of degrees on my wall and a bar certificate. That's not the life that I chose to live. I had family members. My grandfather was a pastor. My aunt was a choir director. My sister sang in the choir. I did music in the choir. My family made wholehearted efforts to make sure that I got my education and I made something out of myself and I didn't fall victim to the streets, right? Because there was definitely gangs around and all of that. If you wanted to get into it or if you basically had no choice because your family was in it, that was there. But like I said, and shout out to my family for making sure that, I was in activities and focus on education and all of that. So I didn't fall into any of that life, right? But with that said, and the reason why I mentioned that is I acknowledge, if you're in the streets, if you're a street dude, if you're a gangster, gangsters and civilians have different rules in terms of how they go about things. But that doesn't mean that I can't have an opinion on this. And my opinion is that, going after Gunna is ridiculous. I just think it's unfair and ridiculous given the impossible situation that he was put in. From my understanding, Gunna is a rapper. Gunna is an entertainer. Gunna is not a gangster. Gunna is not a street dude, right? And so to impose upon him rules that you would put on another gangster is it's just unfair, right? And what ended up leading to him being labeled as a snitch was the plea. So a lot of times, well, actually all the time, when you enter a plea to a particular charge or particular charges, there has to be asserted what's called a factual basis for the plea, right? So you have to give the information as to why you're taking the deal, right? And I don't know if things are a little different in Georgia. It appears that things are different. Here in California, you don't have the DA reading out the allegations as the factual basis for the plea. What happens is, your attorney will write in what the factual basis for your plea is. So let's just say if it were a DUI, then your attorney would write down, I unlawfully drove a vehicle while under the influence of alcohol, right? And so then the judge is going to read that plea agreement, and when he gets to the factual basis, he's going to say, well, do you agree that on the dates charged, you drove a vehicle while under the influence of alcohol? And you would say yes. And, are you saying that because that's in fact what you did? And then you say yes, right? Well, if you watch that video of the plea in Gunna's case, the DA was kind of going off and reading all these facts, right? And what seemed to be the most problematic was the admission that YSL is a gang and, YSL must end. And, the event in which, he was in the vehicle, I believe Thug was also in the vehicle, and they found contraband, and he admitted that it wasn't his. And so if it wasn't his, then it had to be the other person in the car, right? And I would just say, that's what he did in terms of being on the stand and admitting to those things. But what he didn't do was, he never sat down with the police in an interrogation room and started giving information against Thug or against other members of YSL, right? He never, took the stand as part of Thug's trial and testified to these things, right? The plea, the language in the plea was not admitted at trial against Thug, right? So the idea of painting this as if Gunna did, he might as well have gone and take the stand because of the way that people are treating this situation, as if he, was a witness at the trial and testified against Thug, which actually did not happen. And it's crazy seeing these rap fans, saying the same things, right? All these people who are consumers of the music, you've never committed a crime in your life. You would never, wouldn't bust a grape in a fruit fight, right? And you're sitting up here as a keyboard warrior, right, on the internet, calling this man a rat, labeling him as a snitch, as if he's done something, dishonorable, and you don't live that life, right? And I just think it's so disgusting how people are coming at this dude. At the end of the day, in any negotiation, including a plea agreement, there are going to be terms that are flexible, and there are going to be terms that are not flexible, right? So there are going to be terms that, hey, whether it's 6 months or 4 months might be negotiable. If we're talking about years, if it's, 10 years versus 8 years, that might be negotiable. But there might be certain terms of the deal, sometimes if somebody's charged with multiple counts, there might be a particular count that the prosecutor is interested in. And so, you might be charged with 10 counts. It might be robbery, theft, assault, possession of drugs, possession of weapons. And there might be one or two of those offenses that the DA really wants you to plead guilty to. And they'll agree to dismiss the rest, but they want you to plead guilty to, one of the counts that they want you to plead to. And that just is what it is. And they're not coming off of that, right? So in this situation, it appears that the prosecutor was particularly interested in having him admit on the record that YSL was a gang, right? And just think about it. If he could have avoided having to say that on the stand, I guarantee you he would have wanted to do that, right? It was probably the topic of a conversation between his defense attorney and the DA. I can almost guarantee you the defense attorney didn't want to have his client say that, on the stand, especially, knowing these proceedings were going to be recorded. But if the DA wasn't willing to come off of that as, a term of the agreement, then it was what it was, right? And as part of that agreement, he got time served. He had an executed or a suspended sentence, meaning if he were to mess up while he's on probation, then he can go to prison for, the remaining 4 or 5 years that it was. And so all he has to do is keep his nose clean and he won't be back in prison. But if he violates probation, then he's going back to prison. But, he was in jail for around 7 months, right? And this is a guy who we've already said is not a street dude, is not a gangster. So just by virtue of being a rapper, he's had to be in jail for 7 months, right? Stopping his ability to earn money, stopping his ability to be with his family, with his loved ones, with his girl or his kids, if he has kids, basically losing his freedom for 7 months. As a non-gangster, as somebody who hasn't really committed these crimes, right? So what would you have him do, right? If that becomes an inflexible term from the DA's perspective, if it came down to it where it's like, okay, you either admit YSL was a gang and you admit that YSL needs to end, or if you don't want to, then all right, go, you go to trial. You go to trial with the rest of them. And we saw how long it took. This was from 2022 and Thug just got out. So Gunna would have been sitting right alongside of him. And for what? Just to please all you internet gangsters and even the real gangsters and street dudes, just so you could be like, oh, well, Gunna's a real one. That makes no sense at all. That makes no sense at all for him to reject what was a solid deal just for the purpose of being able to say, oh, well, I stayed 10 toes down, or I kept it real, right? I didn't allow them to push me into doing something that I didn't want to do. No, sometimes you are put in difficult situations and you have to do what's best for yourself. You have to do what's best for your family. But to paint him as somebody who ended up taking the stand and testified at trial is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, at the end of the day, he didn't say anything or he didn't admit to anything that the government didn't already believe that they had, right? I mean, go back and look at the indictment and see all of the offenses that were in that indictment, right? Multiple murders, right? I think there's at least 2 murders, an attempted murder, robbery, theft, possession of weapons by people prohibited from possessing weapons, right? Drug sales. So this is real gangster stuff that was going on in this indictment. Now, as it relates to Thug, what they were trying to say is that he was the leader, or he was the manager or the supervisor, and a lot of this stuff was going on at his direction. But let's not act like there wasn't real crimes committed, like real street stuff being done, right? So it wasn't like, oh, well, now that we got Gunna to say this on the record, now we got the whole case. No, they already had the case. It's just, again, as it relates to Thug, I mean, this case was so messy, right? There was just so much going on that that they had problems ultimately proving their case, which then led to negotiated deals where, they wanted, obviously they were going after Thug to be able to possibly spend the rest of his life in prison and ultimately reach an agreement with them. But again, I just think the idea of labeling him in the way that people have is completely unfair. Now let's talk about this issue with Thug. A lot of people are coming out and saying, listen, like, he's not going to be able to do this. This probation is a trap. He's going to be back in prison. And I disagree with that as well, right? And I don't want to talk about just on a general basis about whether probation is a trap or not, but we're talking about Young Thug, and Young Thug is in a completely different position from everybody else who might end up being given probation. But actually, maybe backing up a little bit, when it does come down to probation, if you get probation versus having to go to prison, it is like a second chance, right? You could have been sentenced to prison, but we're going to give you conditions, and you may or may not have to do some time in jail, right? So typically you can do up to a year. So if they give you half time, you could do 6 months in jail, and then when you're released, then you do probation. Depending on the seriousness of the offense and a person's lack of criminal history, or, they could end up not having to do any time at all. So you could, you get charged, let's just say you get charged with assault. You plead guilty to assault, and you don't actually have to do any jail time, but you get sentenced to 3 years of probation, right? And there's probation conditions. You are not to violate any laws. You may be assigned to a probation officer. If there were drugs or alcohol involved, you might have to do, a drug and alcohol class. If there's any, mental health issues, you might have to, do therapy regularly, check-ins with your probation officer, and things like that. If you successfully complete probation, then you're done. And the reality is, a lot of people do successfully complete probation. Sometimes people don't, and I can understand why people call it a trap. But for Thug, right? For Thug, he has all of the resources available to him to be able to perform successfully on probation. And I remember having a conversation with one of my clients a while back, and she had gotten caught up in this situation, and I didn't love the fact that she had to plead guilty to it, but it was in her best interest to plead, but she was going to be on probation, and she really doubted whether she was going to be able to perform on probation. And I was like, listen, you can do anything you put your mind to. And that is the reality, right? If you are already setting yourself up in your head to fail on probation, then you're going to do so. But if you had to do it, right? Gun to your head. If you had to just live the straight and narrow path and not violate probation, then you could do it, right? Immerse yourself in your job, immerse yourself in your family, immerse yourself in positive things, develop new habits and activities, separate yourself from the people who would be bad influences on you to go back to that activity, right? You can do so many things to help yourself not violate probation. And that's where I think that in Thug's situation, he's in even much better position to be able to do those things. And so going back to, again, the allegations, they had Thug as the leader of YSL as the gang, and the gang was doing gang stuff, right? Murders, attempted murder, carjackings, theft, possession of weapons, drug sales, all these different type of things, and having Thug as the guy that was basically masterminding all these different type of things, right? And so his defense, right, the defense was calling into question the credibility of the witnesses and also separating Thug from this activity, right? Basically saying that, he is a rapper, he is an artist, he's an entertainer, and he is the owner and co-founder of YSL as a record label, not as a gang. And yes, he knows people that are involved in street life, but he's not associated or involved with that directly, and none of this stuff is happening at his direction, right? That was the defense, and ultimately, obviously, he was able to take a deal because this trial, just became so train wrecked that there was the risk of there being a mistrial, right? And one of the things that became or would become interesting at that point is if it were to end in a mistrial, then that wouldn't mean that the case is just dismissed and everybody goes home. No, the DA would have the opportunity to decide to retry that case. And we saw how long this thing lasted. So Thug was kind of put in a difficult position because it's like, all right, well, if it ends in a mistrial and they retry this again, and obviously they weren't going to let him out on bond. He had already been denied bail multiple times. So was he going to spend yet another, year plus in custody trying this thing all over again? And, obviously the DA, if they had an opportunity to do it again, they definitely, I would think, learn from their mistakes, right? They probably streamline the trial a bit more and avoid a lot of the pitfalls that they ended up suffering throughout this trial. And so, at the end of the day, I think the defense was able to acknowledge that, hey, there are certain, they have certain evidence that they could possibly prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And so it makes sense for him to take this deal. And he was able to do a no contest plea to the racketeering charge and one of the other charges, right? So when you do a no contest plea, basically you're saying, hey, I acknowledge the government might have the evidence that is that's sufficient to be able to convict me, but I'm not admitting or denying. I'm just acknowledging that they have the evidence and I'll accept the punishment, right? And so he got time served, right? So now he's home, but the probationary terms, and they're definitely extensive and restrictive, right? These are not the probationary terms that you would normally see in this type of case, but this is, a different situation, right? So he's got to stay away from Atlanta for 10 years. That's obviously not ideal, but, if you're weighing out, all right, let me, carry this trial out to its end or stay away from Atlanta. All right, cool, I'll do that. But he's allowed to come back for weddings and funerals. And there's one other thing, I forget what it was, but he's able to come back for those things. He's going to have to do an anti-gang and anti-drug presentation 4 times a year for the duration of his probation. I think that's good. Like, obviously, he wants to be a positive impact on his city, and he was doing that already, right? During his bond hearing, we had people testify in terms of the good things that he was doing for his city, right? Funding or donating money to Pee Wee football. You had the little motivational speaker saying that, Thug helped him out. And he was doing a lot of charitable stuff in his city. And I think being able to do this and showing that, hey, if you can, escape this life, then, this only leads to death or being in prison. And you don't want either of those, right? You want to be able to live a good life. You want to be able to raise a family and have fun with your kids, play with them and teach them things and do all those wonderful things. Be a productive asset to society, right? You don't want to be dead in your 20s or in your 30s, right? You want to be able to live to get gray hair and all that kind of stuff. Just live a boring life, right? So he's going to be able to leverage his voice, his persona, his credibility, and be able to reach youth in a way that most people cannot, and that's a special thing. He's got to do 100 hours of community service every year. That's just over 2.5 weeks or so of a regular work week. So you knock that out pretty easily, and he can't have any contact with known gang members. And so, these are definitely serious conditions, especially not having any contact with gangsters. But what I would say to Thug, if I had an opportunity to talk to him, or to anybody who is up against having to make a change in their life, like, at the end of the day, we do what we do based on our beliefs, right? We have a certain set of beliefs, which lead to certain sets of thoughts, which lead to certain sets of actions. And so when you need to make a change from something that you've been doing for years, there's a renewal that must happen. You must form new beliefs. and those beliefs lead to different thoughts, which lead to different actions. And so he's got to separate himself from people who have been not the best influence on him, right? So again, if we go back to that indictment and look at all those crimes that were legitimately committed, right? People killed, people, attempted to be killed, armed robbery, drug sales, all these different type of things. Anybody that's involved in that type of stuff, you need to separate yourself from. You just need to stay away for some years. He's got to be away for multiple years to be exact, but he just doesn't need that energy around him. He's got a lot of people that rely upon him, as a businessman, right? He's got a lot of employees. He's got his family to look after. If he can just focus on those things, make good music, be a good person, be a positive influence, then I think he has no problem in the world being able to do this probation and it not be a problem for him to do. But if he sets up in his mind that he can't do this and this is too hard, then yeah, he absolutely will fail. But at the end of the day, he was able to avoid, the DA, they were going after life. And even in the deal that they were reaching, they were trying to offer 45 years. And that's why, the defense ended up negotiating or putting it in front of the judge. So this was a non-negotiated plea because negotiations broke down between the defense and the DA because the DA was trying to get him to sign up for 45 years. And that's absolutely ridiculous. So, he was able to deal directly with the judge. He made his guilty pleas and his no contest pleas, and then the judge imposed the term. So I think, to close it up, I think Gunna was, well within his rights to do what he did. I think that was the wisest situation given the circumstances. And I think Thug, if he puts his mind to it, he'll be able to successfully complete probation and have a positive impact on his state and on his city. If you got something out of this, please show me some love, hit the like button, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And as always, I want to thank you so much for watching. And until next time, peace.